You have 30 days to tear down that wall. Or we tear it down for you and bill you every cent.
Arms crossed. White Lexus idling in my driveway like a threat on four wheels. No letter, no warning, no decency. Just Renata Osgood, HOA board president, self-appointed ruler of this neighborhood, standing on my land, telling me to destroy the 42-foot limestone wall I'd built with my own hands, 11 years ago, stone by stone.
Section 7.4B.
She smirked. I didn't yell. I didn't beg. I just looked at that wall and felt something go very quiet inside me. The kind of quiet that isn't peace. She flashed that rehearsed smile, walked back to her Lexus. Gone. She had no idea what she'd just set in motion. Ever had someone threaten you over your own property? Drop your worst HOA story below, and tell me which state you're in. Let me back up about 12 years, because none of this makes sense without the ground it grew from. Literally. My name is Garrett Calloway. I'm a third-generation electrician out of Hendersonville, North Carolina. My grandfather wired half the houses in Henderson County before OSHA knew what a hard hat was. My dad kept the business running through 2 recessions. I took it over in 2009, which, if you remember your economic history, was a spectacular time to inherit a small business. Nothing like baptism by fire. By 2012, the business was stable enough that my wife Delia and I could finally buy a house. We weren't looking for a showplace. We were looking for a yard big enough for a garden and a porch big enough for 2 chairs. We found it on Laurel Ridge Drive, a quarter-acre lot on the slope of a wooded hill in a quiet, planned community called Sycamore Hollow Estates. Now, estates is a generous word for it. It wasn't gated. It wasn't glamorous. It was 47 homes on a hillside, some vinyl-sided, some brick-fronted, all of them perfectly decent. The HOA existed mostly to maintain the shared entrance, the 2 decorative lampposts, and a small parking area near the clubhouse at the base of the hill. Monthly dues, $48. Reasonable, unremarkable. The lot we bought had a problem we knew about up front. The backyard sloped hard, maybe 15 degrees, toward the rear property line, and beyond that line sat the HOA's common area parking lot. Previous owners had done nothing about it. Every heavy rain, the topsoil bled downhill like rust off a tin roof. So I fixed it. I spent a full summer weekend, 2 of them actually, hand-digging and laying a dry-stacked limestone retaining wall along the base of my property line. 42 linear feet, 3 courses high, filled and backfilled with gravel and compacted soil. A proper wall, the kind that doesn't ask for permission because it doesn't need to. The smell of that summer. Fresh-cut limestone dust, red clay, sweat, and the green, almost medicinal scent of crushed fescue where I'd been kneeling. The weight of each stone in my arms, the gritty texture of the gravel against my palms as I packed it in behind the face. My neighbor Bert Aldridge leaned over the fence and said, "That's the nicest wall I've ever seen on a residential lot." Coming from Bert, a retired civil engineer, that meant something. For 9 years, nobody said a word about that wall. Not one word. Then Renata Osgood joined the HOA board. Renata was, and I'll try to be clinical here, the kind of person who had been waiting her entire adult life for a clipboard. She'd moved into Sycamore Hollow in 2019, into a house twice the size of mine, and within 18 months, she'd maneuvered herself into the position of board president by running unopposed, because everyone else had better things to do. She was precise, humorless, and had the unsettling habit of photographing other people's properties from the street, which she called compliance documentation. Her first 12 months in office, she'd sent letters to 9 households, citing everything from unapproved paint colors to a basketball hoop left at the curb overnight. Small stuff. Harassment dressed up as enforcement. The first time I got a letter from Renata, for a cracked section of driveway apron she'd decided violated visual uniformity standards, I actually laughed out loud. Delia didn't. Delia, who has 20 years of experience reading people, just said, "Garrett, watch that woman." I patched the driveway. I stopped laughing. 6 months later, the letter about the retaining wall arrived. The letter was 3 pages long. 3 pages for a wall. It cited Section 7(4)(b) of the Sycamore Hollow CC and Rs, the covenants, conditions, and restrictions, which required prior written approval from the Architectural Review Committee for any permanent structure or landscape modification visible from common areas. The wall, Renata had decided, was visible from the parking lot. Therefore, the wall was out of compliance. Therefore, I had 30 days to remove it or face a fine of $50 per day, plus the HOA's right to self-help remediation at my expense. I read it twice, slowly, the way you read something when you're trying to make sure you're not misunderstanding it, because misunderstanding it would be more charitable than the alternative. The wall had been there for 9 years. 9 years of HOA board meetings, 9 years of annual dues payments, 9 years of compliance letters going to other people. Nobody had ever said a word. And now, under Renata, a wall that had been holding a hillside together since before she'd even lived in the neighborhood was suddenly an unauthorized structure. I called the HOA's property management company, a third-party outfit called Piedmont Property Solutions, and spoke to a coordinator named Terrence. He was apologetic in the way that people are when they know they're delivering nonsense, but it isn't their nonsense. He confirmed that yes, the board had voted on this. Yes, the vote was 3-1. The one dissenting vote, he mentioned quietly, was from a board member named Walt Fincher, a retired contractor who had apparently said at the meeting that the wall was structurally sound and serves an obvious drainage function. Walt was overruled. I asked Terrence, was there an appeals process? Yes, he said. I could submit a written appeal to the ARC, the Architectural Review Committee. The appeal would be reviewed at the next board meeting in 6 weeks. 6 weeks. The deadline was 30 days. I submitted the appeal the next morning, certified mail, return receipt requested. In it, I laid out 3 things. First, the wall predated Renata's presidency and had never been cited before. Second, it served an active drainage and erosion control function. Third, the section of the CC and Rs she was citing referred to landscape modifications, and a functional retaining wall built to address a slope drainage problem was arguably an engineering improvement, not a cosmetic modification. I also included a single photograph, taken from the parking lot, showing the clear sight line from the common area down to the base of my property line, with a red arrow pointing to the wall. Not because I wanted to help their case, because I wanted them on record acknowledging exactly what they could see from that parking lot, and more importantly, what was holding up the slope above it. Renata's response came 11 days later, not at a board meeting, not through Terrence. A personal letter, on HOA letterhead, signed by her in purple ink. The appeal was denied. The reason cited, the Architectural Review Committee determined that the structure was not approved per community standards and does not qualify for retroactive approval under Section 7.4b(2). Section 7.4b(2). I looked it up. It said that structures built prior to the current ownership of a property could be grandfathered, but structures built by the current owner without approval could not, which was technically accurate. I had built it, I was the current owner, and I hadn't applied for approval because nobody had told me I needed to. Here's the thing about HOA CC and Rs that nobody explains until it's relevant. They're private contracts, not public law, but they're enforced like law, and fighting them costs money, even when you're right. Renata knew this. I was increasingly sure she was counting on it. The diesel smell of the neighbor's truck drifting over the fence that evening, the crunch of dry leaves under my boots as I walked the perimeter of the wall in the fading light, checking every stone I'd set by hand. Solid. Not a single face stone had shifted in 9 years. The gravel drainage bed behind it was clean, free draining, doing exactly what I'd built it to do. I ran my hand along the top course. Cold limestone, rough as a cat's tongue, still carrying the day's chill. I called Walt Fincher. Walt was a 63-year-old retired general contractor who had built commercial retaining structures for 30 years before his knees gave out. He'd been the one no vote. When I explained what was happening, he was quiet for a moment, and then said, in the unhurried way of a man who has seen a lot of avoidable disasters, "Garrett, if they take that wall down, that hillside is going to move." "How long before it moves?" I asked. "Depends on the rain," he said, "but it'll move." I wrote that down. I hired a geotechnical engineer. I know, that sounds like an extreme step, and it was, and I want to be honest. It cost me $900 out of pocket for a site visit and a written report, $900 to document what Walt Fincher had told me for free. But there's a difference between a retired contractor's opinion and a licensed engineer's stamped report, and I had a feeling I was going to need paper. The engineer's name was Dr. Priscilla Vane. She drove out from Asheville on a Tuesday morning in a white Ford pickup, with a university parking tag still dangling from the rear view. She walked the slope with a measuring rod and a moisture meter, took soil borings at 3 points, and spent about 40 minutes crouching at the base of the retaining wall with a flashlight, looking at the drainage layer behind it like she was reading a book she'd been waiting for. Her report, delivered 5 days later in a 12-page PDF, was thorough, precise, and devastating. The slope behind my property, and more importantly, the slope I was retaining on behalf of, was rated a Class 2 cut slope with a minimum factor of safety of 1.2 under saturated conditions. The retaining wall I'd built was maintaining that factor of safety. Without the wall, under heavy rainfall conditions, Dr. Vane projected a probability of shallow plane slope failure of between 55 and 70% within 2 to 5 years, with the most likely direction of failure toward the HOA parking lot at the base of the slope. She included a diagram, a simple, clear diagram with arrows showing exactly where the soil would go. I sent a copy to Renata by certified mail. I sent a copy to Terrence at Piedmont Property Solutions. I sent a copy to every member of the HOA board, all 5 of them, individually, each by certified mail. And then I sent a copy to the HOA's liability insurance carrier, whose name and address I found on a certificate of insurance Terrence had once shared during a different dispute with another homeowner, a copy of which I'd gotten through a public records request to the county, because the HOA had filed it in connection with a drainage easement application 2 years prior. Takeaway: HOA insurance carriers exist to protect the HOA from liability. If you can show the carrier that the HOA is knowingly creating a liability risk, the carrier has an incentive to intervene, because they're the ones who will have to pay. Renata's response arrived within a week. Not a letter this time. An email, forwarded through Terrence, terse and grammatically impeccable. The board has reviewed your submission and reaffirms its prior determination. Compliance remains required by the stated deadline. She'd also, I later learned, called Walt Fincher and suggested, not quite threatened, but suggested, that his position on the board might be difficult to maintain if he continued to act in opposition to board determinations. Walt called me that evening and told me this in a voice that was entirely calm and entirely furious. "She's not going to back down," he said. "I know," I said. "So, what are you going to do?" I thought about that for a moment. Outside, a Carolina wren was raising unholy noise in the dogwood. The smell of pine resin and coming rain, that specific metallic sweetness that means weather is building somewhere over the ridge. "I'm going to comply," I said. Walt was quiet. "I'm going to take the wall down," I said, exactly like she asked, every stone, every course, and I'm going to document every single step while I do it. And then we wait for rain. Here's what I had figured out, sitting at my kitchen table with Dr. Vane's report and $900 of professional opinion and a stack of certified mail receipts. Renata had created a paper trail. In trying to bully me into compliance, she had generated a documented record of the HOA's knowledge of the drainage risk, a licensed geotechnical engineer's assessment of the probable consequences, and the board's deliberate decision to proceed anyway. Every letter, every email, every certified mail receipt was a timestamp on what they knew and when they knew it. In the law, there is a concept called willful ignorance, the idea that you cannot avoid liability by refusing to acknowledge facts that have been placed directly in front of you. Renata had not ignored Dr. Vane's report. She had read it, or at least received it, and acted anyway. That's not ignorance. That's something far more useful to me. That's knowledge. I took the wall down on a Saturday in October. I didn't hire anyone. I did it myself, stone by stone, course by course, the same way I'd put it up, partly because I wanted the exercise, partly because I wanted witnesses, and partly because there is something clarifying about the physical act of dismantling something you built with your own hands, at someone else's insistence. It focuses the mind. Delia filmed the whole thing on a tripod-mounted camera, not phone footage. A proper camera, 4K, set at a wide angle that captured both the wall and the parking lot below. She filmed every course as it came down. She filmed the drainage gravel as I shoveled it out. She filmed the bare soil underneath, dark and saturated from a rain 3 days prior, already beginning to slump slightly toward the property line now that the stone face was gone. Bert Aldridge from next door leaned over the fence around noon, eating a sandwich, watching. "You sure about this?" he said. "Nope," I said. "Okay," he finished his sandwich. "You want help stacking the stones?" I did. We stacked them in my driveway, neatly, labeled with chalk numbers for each course, like I was planning to reassemble them. Which I was, eventually. The stones themselves had cost me $400 in 2012, and hadn't gotten cheaper. By 4 in the afternoon, the wall was gone. The slope below my property line was bare, graded to its original angle, held by nothing except topsoil and the roots of some volunteer fescue and a few tulip poplars that were doing their best. I photographed the slope from 8 angles. I photographed the parking lot below. I photographed the sky, which had turned the specific shade of pewter gray that old-timers around here call a soaker sky. Then I called a civil engineer, a different one from Dr. Vane, a practical structural guy named Roy Beaumont, who did site work for my electrical business occasionally. And I asked him one question. Without the retaining wall, what's the load-bearing capacity of the soil shelf above the parking lot? Roy came out the next morning, Sunday, looked at the slope for about 10 minutes and said, "Garrett, you need to put that wall back." "I know," I said. "How long before this fails?" "With a good rain? Could be weeks. Could be a season. Probably not longer." I nodded. I thanked him. I did not put the wall back. Now, I want to be transparent with you here, because some of you are already yelling at your screen. "Garrett, you irresponsible so-and-so. You're setting up a hazard." And that's a fair concern. So let me tell you what I also did. I called the county building department and reported, in writing, that I had removed the wall under HOA direction, and that the exposed slope now represented a potential drainage hazard to the adjacent common area parking lot. The county logged the report. A code enforcement officer drove by and took photographs. He confirmed the condition and issued a formal note in the county's records. Takeaway: if someone forces you to create a potentially dangerous condition, document it with a neutral third party. A government agency is better than anyone, so that the record of who ordered what is publicly established. I also went to 3 of my neighbors, people I'd known for years, people who had also received letters from Renata for various invented violations, and I told them exactly what I was doing and why. I showed them Dr. Vane's report. I showed them Roy's verbal assessment. I showed them the certified mail receipts. Their reactions were uniform, a kind of quiet, focused anger that people get when they realize the thing they've been individually experiencing has been systematically applied to all of them. One of those neighbors was a woman named Cecilia Pruitt, who had moved into Sycamore Hollow 6 years prior and had been cited by Renata for, among other things, a vegetable garden in her side yard. Cecilia was 61, retired, and had 30 years of experience as a paralegal. She read every document I showed her without speaking. When she finished, she handed them back and said, "Garrett, how many of these certified mail receipts do you have?" 23, I said. She nodded slowly, the way someone nods when a plan is assembling itself without them having to say it out loud. "Good," she said. "Keep them all." It was Cecilia who found it. 2 weeks after I took down the wall, she called me on a Thursday evening and said, "Can you come over? I need to show you something in the CC and Rs." I walked the half block to her house. She had the original HOA documents spread across her dining room table, the actual founding documents, filed with Henderson County in 1994 when Sycamore Hollow Estates was developed, and she had a yellow legal pad covered in notes, and she had the expression of someone who has spent 30 years parsing contracts and has just found the paragraph that changes everything. She pointed to section 11.2 of the original CC and Rs. It was titled, Common Area Maintenance and Drainage Easements. The relevant language, which I will paraphrase because it was written in 1994 legal boilerplate that would put a caffeinated raccoon to sleep. The HOA, as the governing body responsible for common areas, had accepted explicit maintenance responsibility for drainage structures that served to protect common areas from adjacent lot line runoff. This responsibility had been included by the original developer, a company called Ridgeline Properties LLC, because the entire subdivision had been built on a hillside, and drainage had always been the central engineering concern. In plain English, the retaining wall I built wasn't just on my property protecting my yard. It was a drainage structure that protected HOA common property from adjacent slope runoff. And under the founding CC and RS, the HOA had a duty to maintain drainage structures in that configuration, or, at minimum, not to interfere with them. Which meant Renata hadn't just ordered me to remove a wall. She had ordered me to remove a structure the HOA itself had a legal obligation to protect. Cecilia looked at me over her reading glasses. She voided their own covenant, she said. Can she do that? She did do it. Whether she had the authority to is a different question. She tapped the legal pad. But here's the thing. The original developer, Ridgeline Properties, filed this with the county. It's a matter of public record. The board can't amend it without a supermajority vote of the homeowners, not just the board. And they never took that vote. Takeaway. HOACC and Rs are often written by developers with protections that benefit all homeowners, protections that later boards may not even know exist, let alone respect. Always get the original filed documents from the county recorder, not just what the HOA sends you. I sat down at her table. Outside, the first cold front of November was coming through, rattling the storm windows, carrying the smell of wet oak leaves and wood smoke from somewhere up the ridge. We had something now, not just a geotechnical report and a stack of certified mail receipts. We had evidence that the HOA board had violated its own founding covenant, the very document it derived its authority from, when it ordered the removal of a drainage structure it was legally obligated to protect. There was one more thing Cecilia showed me that evening. In the county property records, Sycamore Hollow HOA had a $180,000 line of credit secured against the common area assets, including the parking lot. The credit line was held by a regional bank, and it had a standard clause. The bank could call the loan if the common area assets were materially damaged or devalued. A parking lot swallowed by a hillside would qualify as materially damaged. Renata had handed me the sword. The weather was going to hand me the swing. There's a particular pleasure in building a case the way you build a retaining wall, stone by stone, each piece fitted to the one before it, the whole structure deriving its strength not from any single element, but from how they lock together. I'd spent 30 years in electrical work understanding that principle. A single wire doesn't power a building. The system does. So we built a system. Cecilia handled the legal architecture. She drafted a formal letter, not from me, but from a coalition of 11 Sycamore Hollow homeowners who had all received compliance letters from Renata in the previous 2 years, citing the Section 11.2 covenant breach and requesting an emergency homeowners meeting under the provisions of Section 14.1, which allowed any group of 10 or more homeowners to petition for a special meeting of the full association. The petition required the board to schedule the meeting within 30 days. We sent it certified mail, all 11 signatures, to each board member individually. Meanwhile, I had 3 parallel tracks running. The first was documentation. Roy Beaumont came back every 2 weeks to assess the slope condition and write dated field notes. I was photographing it twice a week. Same 8 angles, same camera settings, time-stamped. The county's drainage inspector had been out once already. I called him again and mentioned, casually, that the condition had not been remedied and that I was concerned about liability. He came out and took his own photographs. We now had county records showing the exposed slope on 3 separate inspection dates. The second track was financial. I called the bank that held the HOA's line of credit, not to make trouble, but to ask a question. Specifically, I called their commercial lending division and asked whether a homeowner could request information about the collateral securing a loan to an HOA of which the homeowner was a member, given that the HOA's financial obligations ultimately fell on the members. The loan officer I spoke to, a careful, precise woman who clearly had a law degree hiding under her banker's demeanor, confirmed that members had a right to certain information and suggested I submit a written request. I did. The bank's response confirmed the material damage clause. I flagged it in a memo. Takeaway. If your HOA has debt secured against common area assets, and those assets are damaged, the lender has standing to intervene, and they will, because it's their money. The third track was the most important and the most patient. Walt Fincher had been quietly gathering support among the other homeowners, people who'd been on the receiving end of Renata's compliance letters, people who'd watched dues go up while nothing visible improved, people who'd been told their landscaping choices were non-compliant by a woman who had moved in 3 years ago and decided she owned the place. Walt was not an angry person by nature. He was a builder. He understood that structures, physical and social, fail when their foundations aren't sound. He talked to people in driveways and at mailboxes. He didn't editorialize. He showed them documents. He let the documents do the talking. By the third week of November, we had commitments from 29 of the 47 homeowners to attend the special meeting. 29 out of 47 is 62%. The CC&Rs required a simple majority of present homeowners to pass a no-confidence resolution against a sitting board member. The special meeting was scheduled for the first Tuesday in December. Now, about the physical trap, because that's what some of you have been waiting for, and I won't pretend otherwise. I had removed the wall under protest and under documentation. The slope was bare, draining poorly, building up hydrostatic pressure every time it rained. What I had done, working with Roy, was install a temporary erosion control measure on my side of the property line, a line of fiber wattles, compressed straw tubes staked into the slope that slowed water flow without actually retaining the soil mass. They were entirely within my property. They were entirely unremarkable. What they did was channel the water more narrowly, concentrating surface runoff toward a single point at the base of the slope, rather than allowing it to sheet across the property line broadly. Roy had identified that point as corresponding to a weak seam in the parking lot's subbase, a repair patch from 2019 that had been done cheaply, with inadequate compaction. I hadn't created the weak spot. The HOA had created it, in 2019, with their own cut-rate paving contractor. I had simply ensured that when the rain came, it would introduce itself to that weak spot directly. The forecast for the week of the special meeting called for 2 to 3 inches of rain over 48 hours. The smell of patience is a lot like limestone dust, if you've worked with it. Dry and faintly mineral, and completely without urgency. I stacked my stones in the driveway and waited. Renata found out about the petition. I don't know how. Probably Terrence, who was in the difficult position of working for the board while clearly not enjoying it. But within 4 days of us sending the certified letters, Renata called a board meeting and attempted to preempt the special homeowners meeting with a set of procedural maneuvers that were, I'll admit, technically creative. First, she proposed that the board vote to amend Section 14.1, the provision allowing homeowners to call special meetings, to require a 2/3 majority of all homeowners rather than a simple majority of 10. Walt voted no. The motion passed 3-1. Whether this amendment was valid without a full homeowner vote was, of course, exactly the kind of question Cecilia had already anticipated. Second, she sent individual letters to 4 of the 11 homeowners who had signed our petition, each letter citing a different compliance issue: a porch railing, a satellite dish, a fence color, and threatening fines if not corrected within 15 days. The timing was obvious enough that 2 of the recipients called me laughing. The other 2 were less amused, but neither withdrew from the petition. Third, and this one I found genuinely impressive in its audacity, she contacted a local homeowners association consulting firm called Carolina's Property Compliance Group and hired them, at HOA expense, to conduct an independent audit of Sycamore Hollow's governance documents, presumably to find some basis for invalidating our petition. She approved the expense herself, as board president, without a board vote. Walt documented this in a written objection filed with Terrence. Takeaway: a board officer who expends HOA funds without proper board authorization may be personally liable for that expenditure, and the record of the unauthorized spending is itself a governance violation. Walt called me after each of these developments. He reported them the way a field engineer reports site conditions, factually, without alarm. "She's spending money she doesn't have authority to spend," he said. "Good," I said. "She's trying to disqualify the petition on the amended Section 14.1. Cecilia says the amendment is void without a homeowner vote. She's ready to argue it. Renata's hired a lawyer." Walt paused. "HOA's lawyer, technically. Firm out of Charlotte. She approved the retainer herself. Another unauthorized expenditure. Another timestamp. What Renata didn't know, what she couldn't have known, because I hadn't told anyone except Cecilia and Walt, was that I had already consulted with an attorney of my own. Not an HOA attorney, a real property and civil liability attorney named Douglas Farrell out of Asheville, who had 15 years of experience suing homeowners associations. Doug's assessment, after reading everything, was direct. If the slope failed and damaged the parking lot, and if the HOA had received Dr. Vane's report and proceeded anyway, we had an excellent case for contribution, meaning I could seek to have the HOA share or absorb the repair costs rather than pass them to homeowners. We also had a colorable claim for harassment based on the selective and retaliatory nature of the compliance letters. Doug had one other observation. He'd seen the Section 11.2 covenant. He said, with the measured tone of a man who charges by the hour and doesn't waste words, "If this goes to a jury, I want to read that covenant aloud in the opening statement." The rain started on the Sunday before the Tuesday meeting. Not dramatically, just the slow, gray, patient kind of North Carolina rain that settles in and forgets to leave. The kind that soaks through an inch of topsoil an hour. I stood on my back porch and watched the bare slope darken as it drank. The fiber wattles were doing their quiet work. The parking lot below sat empty and still, its 2019 patch repair invisible under a sheen of standing water. Delia stood beside me with her coffee, watching the same thing. She had been calm throughout all of this, steadier than me, honestly, but I could tell from the set of her jaw that she was calculating. "You think it'll move before Tuesday?" she asked. "Roy says it's close," I said. She nodded. She drank her coffee. "Garrett," she said after a while. "Yeah. Make sure we have good footage." The camera was already on the tripod. Hello. Monday morning I woke at 5:30 to the sound of rain on the metal roof. The specific, layered sound of a real soaker, not a shower. The kind that doesn't vary in intensity but simply accumulates, patient and indifferent, the way a debt accumulates when nobody's paying attention. I walked the slope at first light. The bare soil was saturated, visibly swollen. The topsoil layer separated slightly from the clay beneath, the way wet paper separates from a surface. The fiber wattles had concentrated runoff exactly as Roy had predicted, a thin, dark channel of moving water angling toward the lower corner of the property line, toward that 2019 patch in the parking lot asphalt. I filmed it, wide shot, close shot, timestamp visible in frame. I texted Roy, "Slope is moving. What's your read?" Roy replied 40 minutes later. I imagined him out in his truck, windows fogged, looking at weather radar. "You'll know by this afternoon." Meanwhile, Renata was not having a quiet morning. At 8:15, she called Terrence and demanded that the special homeowners meeting be postponed, on grounds that the board's legal counsel hadn't completed their review of the petition's procedural validity. Terrence, to his considerable credit, informed her that the Section 14.1 amendment the board had passed was itself under legal challenge, and that postponing the meeting would likely be viewed as another governance violation. Renata, according to Terrence's later account, was briefly silent and then said, with great precision, "Schedule the meeting." At 10 o'clock, the Carolinas Property Compliance Group, the consultants Renata had hired at unauthorized HOA expense, submitted their audit report. Their conclusion, on the Section 11.2 covenant question, was ambiguous in the way that paid consultants sometimes are when the truth is inconvenient for the party paying them. They acknowledged the covenant existed. They argued it was outdated and likely superseded by subsequent board determinations. They did not cite any authority for this position because there wasn't one. Cecilia read the report in about 20 minutes and then wrote a 4-page rebuttal memo that dismantled it citation by citation. She sent it to every homeowner on our contact list. By noon on Monday, Renata apparently realized she had a problem that paper wasn't going to solve. She drove to my house. I saw her from the window. The white Lexus SUV, the controlled walk up the driveway, the expression of someone who has decided that a direct conversation will be more efficient than further correspondence. I will give her credit for that. She was wrong about most things, but she wasn't a coward. I opened the door before she knocked. We stood on my porch. The rain was still coming down. The smell of wet clay and pine needles filled the air between us. She said, "I'd like to discuss a resolution." I said, "I'm listening." What she offered, and again I'll credit her for the attempt, was a compromise. The board would retroactively approve the wall, waive the fines, and withdraw the compliance letters against the 4 homeowners she'd targeted, in exchange for us withdrawing the special meeting petition and agreeing not to pursue legal action. It was a reasonable offer, as far as it went. 6 weeks earlier, I probably would have taken it. "There's a slope moving behind my house right now," I said, "and there's a parking lot below it that the board has been on notice about since September, and there's a bank that has a material damage clause on the HOA's credit line, and there's a room full of 29 homeowners who are expecting to vote tomorrow night. A retroactive wall approval doesn't address any of that." She looked at me for a moment. Something moved behind her eyes. Calculation, reassessment. "What do you want?" she asked. "I want the meeting," I said, "and I want it to happen after people have seen what's happening to the parking lot." She left without answering. At 2:47 in the afternoon, the weak seam in the parking lot began to fail. I know the exact time because the camera was running. It didn't fail dramatically, not a collapse, not a sudden sinkhole swallowing a car. It was slower than that, and somehow worse. A gradual, visible subsidence, the asphalt surface cracking in a curved line, the ground beneath simply declining to hold its former position. A depression, maybe 8 feet across and 4 inches deep at the center, the cracked asphalt edges angling inward like the edges of a deflated cake. By the time I walked down to look at it, there was standing water in the depression. The water was the color of Carolina clay, red-brown, opaque, the color of consequence. I filmed it from every angle. I called Roy. "There it is," he said. Tuesday night. The Sycamore Hollow Estates Clubhouse, a room that usually held annual budget reviews and argued about holiday decoration policies, was set for 47 chairs and holding 63 people. Word had gotten out, not just among homeowners. The Henderson County Register had picked up on the story from a tip. I'll be honest, the tip came from Cecilia, who had the sense to understand that a local newspaper covering a meeting is a different kind of witness than a neighbor in the back row. A reporter named Abby Stokes sat to the side with a notebook and a phone propped up for recording. The county's code enforcement officer, Marcus Webb, attended as an official observer at my request, noting that an active drainage event connected to a formal complaint was in progress. He sat in the front row and did not look at his phone. The parking lot was visible through the clubhouse's glass rear doors. Floodlights had been set up, by me, 2 hours before the meeting, with full permission from Walt, who as a board member had keycard access to the clubhouse. The depression in the asphalt was visible from inside, through the glass, a dark, irregular wound in the parking lot surface, still draining, still growing slightly as the rain continued. I had set up Delia's camera on a tripod facing the rear doors, so the parking lot was visible in the background of everything that happened next. Renata called the meeting to order at 7 o'clock. She was composed, I'll say that. Whatever she was feeling, she dressed well and kept her voice even. She began with a procedural agenda, approval of prior minutes, treasurer's report, and I let her go through it, because I wanted the record to show that I had not disrupted the meeting. Then Walt made a motion to suspend the regular agenda and proceed to the homeowner petition items. It required a second. 7 hands went up simultaneously. The room understood. Cecilia stood and presented the case. She was not dramatic. She was methodical. She walked the room through the timeline, the compliance letter, the certified mail appeals, Dr. Vane's geotechnical report, projected on a screen from her laptop, the board's documented receipt of that report, their decision to proceed anyway, the Section 11.2 covenant, the board's covenant breach, the unauthorized expenditures, the parking lot's current condition, visible through the glass doors behind her. When she finished, she asked the room to direct their attention to the parking lot. They didn't need to be asked. They were already looking. Then I stood up. I didn't have a prepared speech. I decided against one, because prepared speeches in rooms like this sound like prepared speeches, and what I had wasn't a speech. It was a question. I said, "In September, I sent the board a licensed geotechnical engineer's report, saying that removing this wall would put the parking lot at risk. The board has that report. I have the certified mail receipts confirming they received it. I want to ask the board, on the record, with a county code enforcement officer and a reporter present, was the board aware of the drainage risk when they reaffirmed the compliance order?" The room was very quiet. Renata said, "The board determined that the report was inconclusive. The report gave a 55 to 70% probability of slope failure under heavy rain conditions, I said. It's currently raining. The parking lot is currently failing. I'd like to know what would have constituted conclusive. More silence. Then one of the other board members, a man named Keith Delacour, who had been quiet through all of this, said in a voice that was tired and a little ashamed, "We should have listened to Walt." The room exhaled. Renata began to say something about process, about proper authority, about the board's fiduciary, and then Marcus Webb, the county code enforcement officer, raised his hand and said, quietly and precisely, that he would need to place an official notice on the parking lot structure that evening, citing active drainage damage and prohibiting use until assessed by a licensed engineer. He noted that the county's records showed a formal drainage complaint had been filed in October, and that no remediation had occurred. He stood up, walked to the glass rear doors, and posted the notice on the outside of the door with a piece of official orange tape. You could hear the tape going on. Renata sat down. The homeowners present voted 31-5 to remove her from the board presidency. The vote was not close. The motion passed under the original Section 14.1, which Cecilia had argued, correctly, as the Charlotte attorney would later concede, had never been validly amended. Walt Fincher was elected interim board president by acclamation. Abby Stokes from the Register was writing very fast. The parking lot cost $43,000 to repair. The HOA's liability insurance carrier covered $31,000 of it, citing the board's documented receipt of Dr. Vane's report as establishing prior knowledge of the risk. The remaining $12,000 was sought from Renata personally, through a civil action filed by the new board under Walt's leadership, on the basis of her unauthorized expenditures and covenant breach. That case settled out of court. I don't know the terms. I don't need to. My retaining wall went back up in February. Different weather than October. Cold and clear. The kind of February day where the light is thin and the air smells of creek water and dormant grass. Bert Aldridge helped again. Roy Beaumont signed off on the construction. The Henderson County Building Department issued a formal retroactive acknowledgement of the wall's compliance with drainage code, which I framed and put in my garage. Delia found that funnier than the wall falling down. Doug Farrell sent me a bill that was lower than expected, with a note that said the situation had resolved cleanly, and he'd adjusted accordingly. I paid it and sent him a bottle of bourbon, because that's what you do. Here's what I want you to take away. Not the drama, but the mechanics, because the mechanics are the part that's actually useful. First, get the original filed CC and Rs from the county recorder, not from the HOA. They're public documents. What the original developer wrote may protect you in ways the current board doesn't want you to know about. Second, when someone forces you to do something potentially dangerous, document it with a neutral government authority before you do it. File the report. Get the inspector out. Create the paper trail. Third, HOA boards derive their authority from their founding documents. An action that violates those documents isn't just wrong. It may be legally void. A paralegal neighbor who understands contracts is worth 100 angry emails. Fourth, follow the money. HO, as with secured debt, have lenders who care about asset values. Lenders who care about asset values pay attention when those assets are at risk. But beyond the tactics, here's the thing I keep coming back to. Renata didn't destroy herself because she was evil. She destroyed herself because she'd spent so long in a small amount of power that she'd forgotten power is a service, not a property. She thought the rules were tools she owned. They weren't. They were shared infrastructure like a retaining wall. They only work if everyone maintains them honestly. The Sycamore Hollow Estates HOA, under Walt's interim leadership, did several things in the year following the December meeting. They renegotiated the property management contract with Piedmont, adding transparency requirements and regular audited financials. They established a homeowners liaison committee to review compliance letters before they were issued, meaning no one resident could be targeted without multi-party review. And they did one more thing, which was Walt's idea, and which I didn't see coming. They used $2,000 from the HOA's reserve fund, money that had been budgeted for unspecified community improvements for 3 consecutive years and never spent, to endow a small annual scholarship for a graduating student from Hendersonville High School, pursuing a degree in civil engineering or environmental science. The scholarship is called the Sycamore Hollow Community Excellence Award, and the first recipient was a girl from the south end of the county who wanted to study watershed hydrology. I presented the check at a community cookout in June. The smell of charcoal smoke and cut grass, kids running through sprinklers, the limestone wall at the back of my yard, solid and sunlit and entirely unremarkable, exactly as a good wall should be. The girl's name was Freya Moss. She shook my hand, thanked me, and immediately started asking Roy Beaumont questions about soil saturation rates that he spent 45 minutes happily answering. Build the right walls, maintain the right systems, know your documents.
So that parking lot renter was so problem? $43,000 to fix. The same parking lot that sat perfectly fine for 11 years, right up until the day she ordered the wall turned down. Here's what this story is really about. Rainstorm thought she had all power. She forgot one thing. Garrett had all the documents. He didn't win because he lost his temper or showed up that board meeting ready to fight. It was because he did one thing most people never bother to do. He prepared before he reacted. He got the engineer's report. He flew with the county. He pulled the original CCNRs from the recorder's office, documents the board didn't even know existed, and found the exact clause that buried them. That's not revenge, that's the homework. Rainstorm had no title and a clipboard. Garrett had 11 years of limestone and a paper trail she never saw coming. And I think a lot of you watching right now know exactly how that porch conversation felt. Someone standing on your property, smiling, telling you what you're allowed to do with that yours. That specific kind of power is strange. But you want to say something, but you know the smartest move is to say nothing. Never says nothing, and then he let the rain do the talking. If you got an HOA story, a fight that made no sense, a rule that targeted only your homes or your house, a board president who forgot who they actually vote for, drop it in the comments. I read every single one. If this one hit home, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe because the next story makes this one look tame. The word is back up, the parking lot is patched, and the rental license has been used in all L'Oreal Bridge drive scenes.